So, as all of you will have heard by now, General Colin Powell has passed away. And it's pronounced Colin because his parents are from Jamaica, but he has some Scottish ancestry. So apparently they pronounce it Colin over there. So that's why it's Colin and not Colin. So it is pronounced Colin Powell. Anyway, he was Secretary of State who went in front of the United Nations and held up the vial and lied and said that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq when there really weren't. And so he helped lie the country into that illegal invasion of Iraq, which led to the death of hundreds of thousands of civilians. So, all in all, very bad policies and horrendous decision making that led to the awful foreign policy that has been uh, plaguing the world for a while now. So that's who he was. And of course, there's a rehabilitation effort going on saying he was so great. Oh my gosh, such a patriot. Wonderful, such a principled Republican because later he opposed Trump and all that. And yeah, so totally wonderful. Colin Powell, wonderful guy. So obviously, it's quite sickening how a lot of these people who have made horrible foreign policy decisions are being rehabilitated. And it's awful in general how a lot of these not good people get rehabilitated, especially after their deaths. But here is why I think that most rehabilitation efforts fail. Now, let me just say, I don't know if the rehabilitation efforts of Colin Powell will succeed or not. I actually haven't. I think it's too soon to tell at the moment, but let's look at some patterns. So let's start with a classic example, Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, when he was president, was probably the worst president ever. He started the war on drugs to target Black people. He massacred thousands of Asian people, 500,000 in fact. He did a genocide in Southeast Asia with all the bombings. Richard Nixon was also known for his dirty tactics, his spying, his insanely horrid backhanded policies. Richard Nixon also overthrew Chile. And of course, way back in the day when Richard Nixon was the vice president, he was the vice president in the President Dwight Eisenhower administration. And remember, the Eisenhower Nixon administration overthrew the secular government of Iran. They overthrew Prime Minister Mossadegh. So Nixon was involved in a lot of bad things, and he spearheaded a lot of bad things too. And now, of course, Richard Nixon, the thing that took Richard Nixon down was Watergate, the wiretapping, and he resigned before he could get impeached. So he was not impeached. But the point is, after Richard Nixon left, he was pardoned a month later by his friend, Jerry Ford. And of course, that was really the catalyst that started the rehabilitation effort of Richard Nixon. Now, what happened with that? So while Richard Nixon was alive, he was fully rehabilitated. He was welcomed back into polite society. He was heralded. He was worshipped. He got his ass kissed a lot, and basically they acted like he had done nothing wrong. And everyone was in love with Nixon. Nixon was the darling of the media, and Nixon was this, and Nixon was that, and Nixon was the new cool guy who had just made a mistake. But then Richard Nixon died 27 years ago. He died. He had strokes and he died. So what happened after he died? So after Richard Nixon died, people forgot about him in that they forgot the rehabilitation efforts, if you will. So the rehabilitation didn't matter. Let me explain because I'm not being very clear right now. So what happened to Richard Nixon after he died is that people continue to think of him as a horrible president, and a lot of people think of him as the worst president. And Richard Nixon is remembered as an awful, awful, awful president. So that would indicate that the rehabilitation effort failed, right? Because now that he's dead, people aren't trying to rehabilitate him anymore. And, well, looks like it turned out well and people came to their senses. Sort of. So on the one hand, the positive is that people do regard Richard Nixon as an awful president, and rightfully so. But some people have rehabilitated parts of Richard Nixon while they still acknowledge that Richard Nixon was bad. So what do I mean by that? Well, they acknowledge that Watergate was awful, but then they pretend that Richard Nixon was otherwise a great president. They're like, oh, if it hadn't been for Watergate, Richard Nixon was a great president. No, that's completely false. As I mentioned, the genocide in Southeast Asia, war on drugs, the overthrow of Chile, and everything else that he did. Oh, and of course, segregated busing. And Richard Nixon destroyed most of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs. So Richard Nixon was an awful president, but we see two things with Richard Nixon in that the rehabilitation effort seems to have failed because people still regard him as one of the worst presidents ever. But at the same time, parts of it have succeeded because people are only focusing on one policy and not on the other awful policies. So this is a little confusing way of saying, in this case, the rehabilitation effort kind of failed and kind of succeeded. Now let's look at another example. Herbert Hoover. President Herbert Hoover was the 31st president of the United States. And of course, he used to be the Secretary of Commerce while Calvin Coolidge was the president. And Calvin Coolidge, if you remember, is mostly known for cutting taxes on the rich and major corporations and deregulating the economy so much, by a lot. His trickle-down economic policies were his Coolidgenomics, were extremely horrendous, and those policies led to the Great Depression, which started under the next president, President Herbert Hoover. And Herbert Hoover tried to deal with the Great Depression by cutting more taxes for the wealthy, cutting taxes more for the wealthy, and by giving more tax breaks to corporations while making World War I veterans go homeless and raising taxes on working people, the middle class, and deregulating even more. So Herbert Hoover did not cause the Great Depression, but he did the same policies that caused the Great Depression, which in turn made the Great Depression get worse. And so Herbert Hoover is rightfully regarded as one of the worst presidents ever, just like Richard Nixon. Now, a lot of people won't remember this, but while Herbert Hoover was still alive, he got rehabilitated so much. Harry Truman made Herbert Hoover his best friend, and Harry Truman had Herbert Hoover go on missions for him. Dwight Eisenhower rehabilitated Herbert Hoover, helped him out a lot, helped out the reputation and publicity a lot, and Jack Kennedy rehabilitated Herbert Hoover. Lyndon Johnson rehabilitated Herbert Hoover. Everyone welcomed him back into polite society and acted like he was their best friend, and they totally forgot that he had done a horrible job during the Great Depression and that his policies had led to literal starvation. And so this awful, disgusting rehabilitation of Herbert Hoover seemed to work while he was alive, and everyone seemed to have welcomed him back into society and totally forgotten his horrible policies. But then he died. Herbert Hoover died like 57 years ago. And then Herbert Hoover died, and today, when people think of Herbert Hoover, they think of the worst president, or one of the worst presidents, the guy who caused the Great Depression. Of course, in this case, people have actually view him as worse than he actually was because he mishandled the Great Depression, which had been caused by the previous president, as because they had the same policies. He didn't actually cause the Great Depression. So in this case, people actually view him as even worse than he actually was. But the point is, the rehabilitation effort totally failed because he died, and he's basically, they're going back to the history books have rightfully recorded him, set him in stone for what he really was. Now, let's go to a different example. Ronald Reagan, who had the same policies as Herbert Hoover and Calvin Coolidge. Ronald Reagan cut tax on the wealthy, raised tax on working people, amplified the war on drugs like Richard Nixon. Ronald Reagan's foreign policy, absolutely horrible, first president to be condemned by the international community, all that stuff. But Ronald Reagan, the difference was, but Ronald Reagan was being rehabilitated while he was still alive. He was able to get the narrative, and he did all this lying and all this Hollywood style acting because he was originally from Hollywood. He was doing all this acting, and he was like, trickle down economics, great, awesome, aren't I so great, rich people, here are your tax cuts. So he was rehabilitating his reputation while he was alive, and people had a positive view of him, and it was a totally incorrect view, but nevertheless, while he was in office, he was controlling and dominating the narrative, which caused people to rehabilitate him in real time, rehab in real time. And now that he's been out of office and dead for like 17 years or something, a lot of smart people have the right view of him and they call him out for his terrible policies and they know that he was awful. But a lot of people who are either not smart or they agree with his horrible policies, they instead still rehabilitate him and think of him as better, and they falsely lie and they say that he was a great president, which he totally wasn't. So in this case, you get a mixed result of some people being honest and knowledgeable with other people being dishonest or maybe not so knowledgeable. So in this case, he was maybe sort of rehabilitated because he was being rehabilitated in real time, which is very different from being rehabilitated after the fact. So this is my long way of saying that my theory is that if people remember how horrible the person was while they were being horrible, then even if they do get rehabilitated, they will be unrehabilitated after they die. So like Nixon and Hoover, they were being rehabilitated while they were alive, but it was after the horrible things that they had done while they were being viewed horribly. So after they died, the rehabilitation unwinded and they became unrehabilitated and people still hate them. See what I mean? So that could happen with Colin Powell because while he was Secretary of State, he was awful and people did know that and they were calling him out for it. And now they try to forget it over the past few years, but I mean, they remembered it back then. So I think that after some time has passed, maybe a few months or years, people will rightfully view him as not good. Oh, and of course, we got to throw in George Walker Bush. He's the king of rehabilitation, I hear, taking candy from Michelle Obama and all that. Yeah, George Walker Bush, awful, 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 awful president. Now, with George Walker Bush, he pretty much had the same policies that I just listed out. Endless war, starting wars based on lies, Hurricane Katrina, tax cuts for the wealthy, deregulation, massive tax cuts to corporations, handouts to the wealthy, handouts to offense contractors. They're offense contractors, not defense contractors. Nothing that they're doing is defense. So they're offense contractors. And of course, I have to add that George W. Bush has been the darling of the media these days. And so the logic is, well, let's just forget what he did, or everyone makes mistakes, everyone is bad. Really, does everyone go ahead and kill people? Does everyone go start wars that kill people? Seriously, wake up. And if everyone were doing something terrible, it still doesn't make it right. Come on. But anyway, he's being rehabilitated in recent years, but that's after the fact, because while he was president, he was massively hated and everyone hated him. He had a negative 37 approval rating or something like that. And everyone rightfully hated him because of his terrible policies. So since he wasn't rehabilitated in real time, people know and remember how awful his policies were and how awful he was. So therefore, it doesn't matter how much the media tries to rehabilitate him, how much the people in polite society try to rehabilitate him. It doesn't matter how much some unknowledgeable weirdo tries to rehabilitate him. It doesn't matter how much that what was her name? Can't remember. The one who had some apparently also issues in the workplace, and she was being very mean to her employees. Ellen DeGeneres, yeah, her. It doesn't matter how much she tries to rehabilitate him. It doesn't matter how much Reese Witherspoon tries to rehabilitate him. Eventually, after George Walker Bush has passed away, is dead, people are going to remember that he was the worst president ever, and all the rehabilitation efforts will have been a waste. And of course, there's an ambulance siren going on while I'm talking, which is interrupting my video. But okay, let me wait for that sound to go away. Okay, the sound has gone away. Okay, I hope everyone's okay and whatever that ambulance is going to. But the point is, after George Bush is dead, none of the rehabilitation efforts will have mattered, because once people die, people remember everything about them. And some people might try to remember the best things. Some people might try to remember the worst things. Some people might try to make things up and make them seem better than they were, or make them seem worse than they were. But anyhow, the rehabilitation efforts are like temporary marker stains, like temporary, like if you write on a whiteboard with a marker, that's temporary. It can be erased. So that's what happens with rehabilitation most of the time. So honestly, I think the rehabilitation efforts of George Bush will fail. I think the rehabilitation efforts of Colin Powell might fail. That's what I have to say about rehabilitation. And I guess I maybe took a few too many words to describe something that was very simple. I really hope everyone watches this and thinks about it for themselves and maybe comes up with a judgment. Now, one last thing. Kyle Kalinske of Secular Talk did a poll on YouTube. And I really hope he watches this video because it's a really good video and I like watching his video. So it would make me feel good if he watched my video. But anyway, Kyle Kalinske of Secular Talk did a poll on YouTube. And basically the gist of the poll was, is it okay to celebrate when bad people pass away? And my answer to that is yes, and they should celebrate when bad people pass away. I think it is a moral imperative to celebrate in those situations. But I also think that you should have been as harsh. People should be as harsh while the people are still alive. So I wouldn't say be extra harder or be extra easier on people just because they have passed on. I would just say be honest. So if, let's say, someone like Genghis Khan passed away, I would say, yeah, he was awful. And yeah, you should celebrate because he killed a lot of people. But if someone like maybe a relative you didn't like passed away, I would just say be honest and be rational and say, well, here's what the relative did right, here's what the relative did wrong. And so if a really bad person like Genghis Khan passed away, of course you should celebrate. That's a thing to be very happy about. But if a person like who is maybe more mixed or maybe not so bad, like someone else passed away, well, I would say, well, use all the facts, use all the policies you have, use everything you have to make your decisions. So it's really a personal thing. But personally, I believe that it is a moral imperative to celebrate when really horrible people do go away. I think it's a moral imperative. Now, that's a morally gray area, but it is what it is. And that's my take on it. I'm trying to remember if there's anything I forgot to say. Yeah, maybe I can make another video on some policy issues and how to judge people based on their policies. Yes, maybe that's what I'll do. But I hope you watch this video. And if you don't, I'll be very sad. No, I'm kidding. I don't really care, but I'm just making this so that my thoughts go out there. So yes, that is it